By January 1st, 2025, Ontario was supposed to be fully accessible. It was a target set 20 years ago by the province, but disability advocates say the new year has brought a broken legislative promise.
Now, the legislation targeted such areas as workplaces, transit, and public spaces as well.
The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act was hailed as groundbreaking when it passed in 2005.
The ayes are 89, the nays are 0.
And over the years, some progress has been made, but critics say it falls woefully short of what was promised.
We are furious. We are determined, and we are ready.
4 independent reviews in 2010, in 2015, 2019 and 2023 documented significant gaps in the law's implementation. Most of their recommendations were ignored. Last November, at public hearings organised by the AODA Alliance, disabled people shared their stories of the barriers they face daily.
As a member of the AODA Healthcare Standard Development Committee, which provided best practices for the care of people with disabilities, I've seen firsthand how Ontarians face significant barriers to accessing essential medical care.
I myself was caught in the healthcare system in the spring of this year. It was surprising to me how many major hospitals, even in the Toronto setting, were not equipped, nor could they deal with accessible rooms with accessible washrooms. That became a crisis. They could not find me a room in a rehab facility, and consequently my complications got worse, and I contracted other airborne diseases in the hospital.
My name is Tammy. I'm a parent speaking on my experience within the public education system. My child has a neurological condition defined as childhood apraxia of speech and developmental coordination disorder. We haven't experienced many systematic barriers to accessing accommodations. 3 minutes isn't enough time. Third-party support services worked with our board to create a transition to school plan that was ignored at school level with no parent communication and no responsible oversight. In our experience, individual CERTs currently have the freedom to make decisions on which child is deemed more deserving of IEPs with no transparency or accountability, causing disparity in the delivery of disability accommodations at school level.
Advocates argue that Ontario's lack of progress stems from a failure of leadership. They point to weak enforcement of accessibility standards, insufficient regulations, and a lack of a comprehensive multi-year plan. One example that the AODA points to is Toronto's new billion-dollar Armory Street courthouse, built by the government, which contains serious disability barriers, as David Lepofsky, the chair of the AODA Alliance, outlined in a recent video.
Let me show you a billion-dollar accessibility bungle, the new downtown Toronto Armory Street courthouse. The courthouse has some good features. Courtrooms have power doors, good acoustics, and space for turning wheelchairs. But important accessibility features are missing or botched. This is despite our warnings about serious accessibility problems for years before the court was built. Jamming 6 criminal courthouses from all over Toronto into one huge downtown Toronto mega courthouse creates new disability barriers. People must travel much further through traffic just to get to court. A longer trip to court saps energy needed for a long day in court from people with chronic fatigue or pain. There's far too little disability parking for the public coming to this court. There's none for the public on the court property, and only 6 street disability parking spots near the court. Any downtown shoppers with disability permits can snatch those spots.
When laws are enforced, change can happen. In Norway, for example, it is now illegal for a website to be inaccessible. Any company found to be non-compliant with the law is given a year to fix the issues. But in the case of Norway's national airline SAS, it wasn't compliant within the time frame and was threatened with a €15,000 fine every single day thereafter. That equates to around $22,000 a day Canadian. After no movement and lots of complaining about how hard it would be to remedy the issues, and with no action whatsoever, the threat of the huge daily fine clearly got them thinking, and in 12 days' time the website was then fixed to everyone's satisfaction, providing change can happen when the law is enforced. The Ontario government maintains that progress has been made, but has yet to issue a formal response to the AODA Alliance's new pledge announced at a news conference at the start of 2025. Led by David Lepofsky, the Alliance outlined practical steps to achieve accessibility across the province.
We are at a pivotal moment in the history of the campaign for accessibility for people with disabilities. We worked with government after government, minister after minister for 20 years. We made suggestions, we made proposals, we offered advice. But what do we do now? Well, the first thing is this. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act did not vanish on New Year's Day. It's still the law. The Ontario government still has the duty to lead this province to become accessible to people with disabilities. And having missed the legislative deadline, the government has the obligation to get us to that goal as soon after that legislative deadline. The government has the obligation to lead Ontario to become an accessible province as soon after that legislative deadline as possible. We're here to give constructive proposals on how to do it.
For now, the vision of an accessible Ontario seems to be just that, a vision. Advocates say the fight for inclusion is far from over. And joining me now is the chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, the AODA for short Alliance. David Lepofsky is back with us here on Double Tap. David, good to have you here and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, and always good to be talking to you.
Now, I say Happy New Year, but as we're already finding out, it's not a great new year for Ontarians. This law that has been enforced now for a number of years, it doesn't seem to be being implemented.
Well, they're doing some things under it. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act was passed 20 years. It had a commendable, ambitious goal of making Ontario accessible to all people with disabilities by addressing people with all kinds of disabilities, physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, such as blind folks like us, and learning disabilities, autism, and so on, and aiming at tearing down all the barriers we face and ensuring new ones aren't created. And I had the privilege of leading the 10-year fight to get this law passed from 1994 to 2005. It was a grassroots movement. We came up with the ideas that are in the law. We fought across the province to get support for it. We got it passed, and we got it passed unanimously in the Ontario legislature in May of 2025. Now, the government got a good start back then in starting to get it implemented, and there have been some actions, and there have been some improvements. But progress under it slowed and slowed to a point where the pace is glacial. And many, if not most, of the barriers we face remain 20 years later. And the legislation, and it's the first that I know of in the world, set a comprehensive deadline. We had to become an accessible province by 2025, January 1st. Well, we woke up on January 21st, and sadly, and to no surprise, we still live in a province full of serious disability barriers.
So talk me through the issues here. What is this about? Is this a political problem? Is this a lack of enforcement? Is it a lack of interest? Is it that the law was passed, there was a lot of noise, and since that noise has moved away or moved on to other things, and of course we've had COVID in the way and everything else, has all of that been factors to slow this bill down, to slow this law down?
All of the above, but I'll boil it down to two huge problems. It's not a problem of public support, because there's been public support for this legislation before it passed and since it did. But there were two huge problems. The first is a lack of leadership at the top of the Ontario government. And that's just not my view. It's the view of 4 government-appointed independent expert reviews. The Act required the government to appoint a person, an independent expert, every 3 or 4 years to take our temperature, see how we're doing, and see what more is needed. And each of those reviews, in increasing tones of severity, said that we're behind, we're not moving fast enough, people with disabilities are not seeing material improvements, and that there's a need for leadership at the government at the top. And unfortunately, we didn't get that. The second problem is when you set about to accomplish something over 20 years, it's really tempting for the people in power to just kick the can down the road. It'll be somebody else's problem. Well, just like if you're an individual and you say, I've got a mission to accomplish something in the next 20 years of my life, you need to set up a plan right at the start, a multi-year plan, a 20-year plan, saying, here's what we're going to get done and here's what we're going to get it done by, so that we're sure we get it all done in time. And the government told us when we proposed this legislation that they needed 20 years because there were so many barriers to remove. And there was pushback in the disability community. Why should I have to wait 20 years? I might not be alive in 20 years. And some of our supporters aren't alive now who fought for this. But it made sense to give people the time they needed. The problem is the government didn't have that 20-year plan. We asked for it over and over. So not surprisingly, the can got kicked down the road. And here we are in a province that does not comply with the province's own legislation.
And you're not taking this lying down. I mean, you've already started essentially a new campaign to enforce the law.
Absolutely. What we've done, we don't believe, and this has been core to the advocacy that I've been involved in, and we're all volunteers. My role as chair of this coalition is a volunteer role. My belief is that when people do things well, you applaud. When they do things poorly, you criticize. But you always come up with constructive suggestions, and realistic ones, doable ones. So what we did on the 6th of January, it was the first day that the legislature building opened in the new year. Now, the legislature isn't sitting, but the building's open. We did a news conference, and at that news conference, we unveiled the multi-year plan that the government needs now. We call it the Accessible Ontario Pledge. It has 10 planks. It's all detailed in the space of about 6 or 7 pages. It's up on our website at AODAalliance.org. And we said we're calling on all the leaders of the 4 Ontario political parties to make the Accessible Ontario Pledge, to say that if they're in power, they'll do it. And for the government that's now in power, we're saying, hey, you're in office. This is your job. Here's the things you need to do. Will you commit to doing this? So we just unveiled that as a constructive agenda, and we're now going to campaign to try to get commitments from all the parties. There's a possibility of an election this spring in Ontario, and if that happens, we'll, of course, be making this an issue in the election.
But it seems ridiculous, doesn't it, David, that you have to go and fight this again, almost litigate this all over again, when the law is on the books? It's not like, does it almost feel like you're back, 20 years ago?
Well, ridiculous is where we live when we do this kind of advocacy, because everybody either has a disability now or gets one later. We're the weirdest minority of all. We're the minority of everyone. So it's kind of ridiculous that government isn't doing its job and therefore hurting the minority of everyone. But that's, when you do disability advocacy, that's what happens. But I am unstoppably optimistic, and that's not because I'm unrealistic. I know what we're up against. But here's the thing. We've got an agenda. We know more about how to do this than we did 20, 30 years ago. We started a movement 30 years ago with 20 people meeting in a room at our legislature. I was one of them. We, at that time, had an impossible dream of uniting people with disabilities. We were only 20 of them, and getting all political parties on side. But in 10 years, we achieved it. that which looked impossible became a reality. And the legislation passed unanimously. Political parties that never agree on the time of day agreed on this legislation. So if you said, do we have an uphill battle now? The answer is yeah, but we know what it means to battle uphill.
Talk me through how this legislation could potentially, at least, if not already, help accessibility on the web in terms of new technologies, because of course that's a huge area for disabled people, which has changed a lot in the past 20 years and has increased, of course, in the last 20 years, the use of technology by disabled people.
Well, you've picked a good example, and in fact it's probably the area where the law had the most impact early on, but has now fallen behind in its implementation. Under the legislation, the government's required to make a series of rules called accessibility standards and then to enforce them in different sectors. And to its credit, the Ontario government passed an information and communication accessibility standard in 2011, and it mandated compliance with the World or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 that were then the lead requirement. Now, we had to really fight to get that standard, and it was actually AA standard. We had to really fight for that, but we got it. The problems are threefold. Number one, the government never deployed effective enforcement. Their enforcement's been pathetic or paltry, depending on the day. And on a really bad day, it's been both pathetic and paltry. The second thing is that the government, at the time, exempted a number of organizations from having to comply, such as smaller organizations, which is kind of ridiculous because people who are creating new web content can create it accessibly at the start and progressively, and whether they're a big organization or a small one. And the third problem is the regulations, fell out of date. There are, new. It didn't cover mobile apps because that wasn't a thing back then. It didn't cover web applications. It was really more designed for static web content. The government has in hand and has been sitting for about 4 years on recommendations on how to update it, but they haven't. By the way, I said there were 3 problems. Here's a fourth. Stephen, the standard way of thinking about regulation of the economy, not just in Canada, but in many countries is, first you regulate the government, then you require it of big organizations, and the last people to comply should be the small organizations like small businesses. And because they're going to take the longest and they have the least capacity. Well, if you think about it, that makes sense in some contexts. It makes absolutely no sense in the web content context. A small organization that has a small web presence can fix it and update it in much shorter time than, the government of Ontario or a major corporate organization. They have much bigger websites. They got a lot more to do to fix them. A small organization can fix them more quickly. So the idea of saying we're going to give the least time to the people who need the most time and the most time to the people who need the least time is ultimately counterproductive. And that's what the Ontario government did.
I mean, based on everything you're saying, how can you remain that unstoppable optimist, David? I don't get it.
I'll tell you why. Number one, I love Star Trek. I'm used to having a vision of an optimistic future, though I don't have 300 years to wait, sadly. But the other reason is because we've fought these battles before. I was involved in 1980 in the fight with many others to get disability added to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, equality for people with disabilities. Now, when we set about to fight for that in 1980, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have social media, we didn't even have personal computers. We had no real way to network across the country. And I, at that point, did the advocacy as a volunteer on behalf of the CNIB. But collectively, we won. And I've written a memoir of that fight, and the title of the memoir should tell it all to you and our listeners. It's entitled Swimming Up Niagara Falls, because that's what it felt like.
Yeah.
But we got there. by the way, it's available online now for free. Just Google Swimming Up Niagara Falls. It's also on Kindle as a for 99 cents or something. But it's available as a free download, and it's being recorded by CNIB as an audiobook. And as soon as that's available, we'll be wanting to make it available, if possible, with no to anyone who wants to grab it and download it, not having to be a client of CNIB. Stay tuned on that. But so I'm an optimist because I'm used to taking on battles that objectively and quite rationally look impossible. I'm also fortified because I'm retired as a lawyer, but I'm teaching law on a part-time basis at a couple of law schools. And I am really enthused by the next generation of young people, including young people with disabilities, who are ready to hit the ground running, who know how to use the internet, who know how to use social media, who aren't going to put up with these barriers.
And ultimately, and as you said yourself, this was an historic law. So this was something which hasn't been replicated anywhere else in the world. So I guess optimism can come from the fact that it does exist. At least there is somewhere to start from. You're not beginning the campaign for this act today.
No, not at all. And in fact, we started in Ontario. It's the first comprehensive accessibility law in Canada. At least 5 other provinces have done the same since then. And our federal government has. Now, some of those other laws are weaker and some of them are a bit stronger. We all have the same problems, but we are eager to make progress here in Ontario and for others to meet us or beat us.
So that's the question, I guess, for our listeners. What can they do? What can people do listening who live in Ontario, who perhaps want to support from outside Ontario? What can people do to help you in your cause?
Okay, well, first, this is important for people, not just in Ontario, but if you live elsewhere in Canada or anywhere around the world, because you might want to come to Ontario. Stay in one of our hotels, and unless it's an American chain, likely you're not going to have Braille on the room numbers in the hotel. That's easy to fix. But no one's put it in an access standard in Ontario, and it's not been fixed. So all of you have an interest in this. Go to our website, www.aodaalliance.org, aodaalliance.org. Right on the homepage, look for the sign-up link to sign up to get our updates, our newsletters. We put them out regularly, often more than once a week, and every one of them will update you and then have a section called How You Can Help. And it will have action tips. So, for example, I mentioned that on January 6th, we unveiled the Accessible Ontario Pledge that we're asking politicians to make here. We will be putting out action tips on how to help us pressure politicians to do this. And people could write those politicians whether they live here, or they could write and say, look, I don't live in Ontario, but I want to consider coming there as a tourist. But I have a disability, and I'm not going to pick Ontario as a tourist destination if it doesn't do a better job on accessibility. And those kind of steps can help even if you're not from Ontario.
Of course, Justin Trudeau has stood down as Prime Minister, and I guess there may well be an election coming soon across Canada. Does that, the potential result of that election affect anything that's happening with this particular act, or does it perhaps have an impact on the desire to fix the problems?
Here's the significance. In Canada, responsibility over the barriers we face is divided between the federal government and the provincial government based on the way Canada's constitution is written. And please don't ask me to explain it. I will put our listeners to sleep, as I do to law students. But what I can tell you is that most of the barriers we face in education, in healthcare, and access to goods and services are the responsibility of the province. So a law like the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act is needed. However, there are a number of barriers we face that are in federal responsibility. So we need the government of Canada to fix them. Now, in 2019, the federal government commendably passed a law called the Accessible Canada Act. And it purports to address accessibility in the federal sphere, in banking, air travel, federal services, access to television and telecommunication programming, and so on. Unfortunately, that law, it had some improvements over the Ontario law and several significant weaknesses compared to the Ontario law. And I and many others advocated to get that law passed. And I just appeared before Parliament a couple of months ago to point out in a 5-year review what's missing and how they should fix it. Now, if there is a federal election, and there's required to be one this year, you can rest assured that the coalition I serve, and I'm sure others, will be writing the federal party leaders and asking them to make commitments on what they will do to address barriers facing people with disabilities in the federal sphere. So if we have an election in Ontario and a federal one this year, we'll be busy as volunteers on two fronts at the same time.
David Lepofsky, it's wonderful talking to you as always. Thank you so much for coming on.
Always great to talk to you, and I love the program.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. Take care.